Thank you, Mr. Pope. It's a pleasure to be under your chairmanship. I'd like to perhaps say a few words on the previous debate, but unfortunately I think the Minister was saved by the bell, perhaps. May I also welcome the Economic Secretary. I'm very glad that he will be replying to my debate today, which actually probably is quite apposite, because there are a number of concerns that I wish to raise that go back really quite some time, indeed in some senses before this government came into office. I think, Mr. Pope, that politicians in this country are neither being open nor transparent about the state of the public finances. Too much government borrowing is funding current consumption. In this way, we are mortgaging our future and expecting subsequent working generations, some of whom have not yet even been born, to foot the bill for the costs of today's healthcare, education and pensions. This approach is neither prudent nor sustainable. Now, this cavalier outlook to public expenditure has a fairly long political tradition in this country. After the Second World War, Britain frittered away its Marshall aid on welfare consumption, in stark contrast, of course, with the Germans under Konrad Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard, who invested the US-backed aid in rebuilding a world-beating German industry. And I have to say, Mr. Pope, my own party has also failed to address this fundamental problem. During several periods in recent decades, particularly in the early 1970s and the early 1990s, the national debt rose as a result of an unwillingness to take difficult and unpopular political decisions to curb current public sector consumption. The current Chancellor of the Exchequer's own diversionary tactic over the past decade has been to use the mechanism of the Private Finance Initiative, or the PFI, and now the PPP, to remove from the public balance sheet a proportion of the capital costs associated with the government's much vaunted investment in the public services. Mr. Pope, the Treasury's response to criticism over PFI has always been pretty robust. The Chancellor argues that the Private Finance Initiative was set up by the previous Conservative administration, which is true, but he also says that the current government is simply adopting the same rules but under tighter accounting standards. Well, I think we were wrong then, and he's also wrong now. The concept of unitary payments, the amalgamation of the capital and service costs of PFI projects, has been adopted as a supposedly simple method of allowing easy comparison between contractors during the PFI bidding process. However, this means that a huge amount of current capital expenditure, which the government would have had to borrow against, is turned into future payments to contractors. In short, the PFI, or I would contend at least that PFI acts as a form of disguised borrowing, with repayment being postponed for up to 30 years. There is no fundamental economic difference between PFI projects and the raising of cash from issues of government debt. The principal and the interest need to be repaid in both cases. The shrewd device of the unitary payment, however, gives rise to a misleading picture of future government financial commitments. The obligation to repay principal sums under PFI projects should be accounted for as a government debt obligation, and unitary payments which contain a capital equivalent component should be accounted in the same way as ordinary government debt. It is, I fear, Mr. Pope, a little difficult to describe the workings of PFI projects without being beset with some arcane or complex terminology. My contention is that the lack of transparency and the use of off-balance sheet funding is not acceptable and would not be acceptable in the private sector. Any company, never mind its auditors, adopting such tactics would be subject to critical scrutiny. Now, the supporters of PFI claim that one of its greatest benefits is the ability to transfer the risk of a project or a service failure to the private sector. And this assertion is often used to justify the superficially generous deals that operators of PFI contracts appear to have won in the course of negotiation. However, the significant profit potential these contracts endow upon operators, evidenced by the inflated share price of many companies who have won lucrative PFI contracts for school, transport system and hospital building here in London, comes at a real cost to future generations of taxpayers who will be footing the bill for today's consumption. I believe that all too often, far too little risk has been transferred. I suspect that some of this is down to poor negotiation with most operators. Take, for example, the bus companies here in London running rings round their public sector contractors and counterparts in drawing up the payment terms. The Treasury admitted to the absence of risk transfer as long ago as July 2003, when it said in the document, PFI meeting the investment challenge, and I quote here, "It is impossible to predict with accuracy the percentage of PFI projects which may fail, but it is important to understand that in the extreme circumstances of failure, the government will be prepared to terminate such contracts in accordance with its legal rights, even if at a loss to financial participants in the scheme. Where this happens, the government will also act within its legal right to ensure that the public service will be maintained." So on the one hand, the government commits itself as the ultimate guarantor, and in truth, many PFI projects cannot be allowed to fail, if only for purely political reasons, as evidenced by the vast and unsustainable deficits accrued by many National Health Service trusts. Yet, on the other hand, there is often no sum representing that cost of being the ultimate guarantor, on the government's balance sheet. Whilst admittedly some £20 billion of the capital value of PFI projects has actually been included on the current government balance sheet, estimated payments on PFI contracts for the 25 years up until 2030 total some £138 billion, which leaves, in my view, £118 billion of public sector debt currently accounted for. This, of course, takes no account of those PFI contracts which are set to last beyond 2030, admittedly a relatively small minority. But most independent calculations suggest that at the very least an additional £25 billion should be added to the balance sheet by including a risk-rated percentage of total liabilities arising from PFI. But even this aggregate of £45 billion, the £20 billion already there, and this additional £25 billion, in my view, would wildly understate the truth of the situation. The fact is, Mr. Pope, that the great majority of PFI projects are in fact undertaken by local authorities. As my own constituents, I suspect, and indeed the constituents of all other London MPs, will soon discover to their horror when the financial implications of many of the contracts agreed to by the current Mayor of London become apparent. Worse still, there has never been any pretence about the balance of risk assessment being made for any of these projects, and once again, given the vital social and political importance of the schemes, central government, as the ultimate guarantor, will have to cough up. We've already seen the early skirmishes in what I suspect will be a particularly high-profile battle between the Treasury and the Mayor of London in relation to the budget for the 2012 Olympics, which has, as some of us have always predicted, spiralled totally out of control. Clearly, a guarantee from the Treasury would have immediately placed this entire project on the government balance sheet and would amount to public borrowing. And I can understand, for that reason alone, why the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Financial Secretary would not have had much truck with that option. But there is also a further category of debts classified as contingent liabilities by the Office of National Statistics. The general rule here, of course, again, is quite plain. Financial reporting should follow the substance of the commercial effect of a transaction, not the form in which it is dressed up. As a result, some £1.25 billion of bonds issued by London and Continental Railway, the body responsible for the Channel Tunnel rail link, were reclassified as government debt in August 2005 because the debt was ultimately guaranteed by the government and the bondholders were not deemed at risk from default. It had been hoped that the Statistics and Registration Services Bill, which has received its second reading in this House in January, would provide the opportunity to end the uncertainty surrounding the government's accounting. I suspect that may prove to be wishful thinking. I know that bill is going through its committee stage and we will no doubt examine it on the floor of the House before too long. But as some of our brightest investment banking brains create ever more complex financial instruments, the line between substance and form becomes ever more blurred. I accept that transparency in these matters may not always be easy to achieve. However, Mr. Pope, I think that the case of Network Rail gives rise to the strong suspicion that this government has at times deliberately manipulated the calculation of government debt. Following the collapse of Railtrack 5 years ago, Network Rail was set up in such a way as to be legally independent of government. The management restructuring and the fiction that Network Rail was under the control of its members as a company limited by guarantee has helped mask the fact that some £18.2 billion of debt has been run up by that company up until July 2006. Just over 2 years ago, the Office of National Statistics received advice from the Department of Transport that the government's support for Network Rail's borrowing was contingent liability of government and was classified as such in the national accounts. Nevertheless, the government has guaranteed the debt, and the fact that Network Rail, a company limited by guarantee with almost £20 billion of debt, is still regarded as having a credit rating of 3A, gives rise to the presumption that the market, at least, recognises that these debts are effectively owed by the government. It should, putting substance before form, therefore, in my view, be on the public balance sheet. Now, Mr. Pope, one of the reasons why the criticism of PFI has been so muted is that private sector operators, contractors, consultants, lawyers, and accountants have made hay over the past decade, playing their part as advisors in a process which has, for them, proved to be extremely lucrative. It is incontrovertible that the explosion in PFI projects will vary from bad to appallingly bad value for the taxpayer, although as a means of avoiding upfront government debt, this device has allowed for an almost unprecedented level of school and hospital building. But we need, I think, to stand back and face some harsh political facts. In the same way as privatisation under the Conservative government in the 1980s and 1990s proved irreversible, even the government's pledge to reverse rail privatisation in the final year of the Conservative administration had to be quietly dropped. So too it will be with PFI, albeit in reverse. In many ways, this has been, I guess, from the Labour Party's point of view, the great genius of vastly expanding these projects since it has come to office. The cost that the taxpayer will have to pay for PFI projects now agreed in the future, that obviously the agreements have taken place now, the projects have taken place or are taking place and will have to be paid for in the decades ahead. But that cost will amount to an ongoing additional burden on public expenditure over the next 25 years or so. Yet the political fallout of trying to unravel PFI projects in essential services means that the room for manoeuvre open to my own future Conservative government in the areas of public expenditure and taxation will be considerably limited. The economic fundamentals of this country do not look so smart looking forward. We are simply kidding ourselves about the true costs of accounting for the future. Ironically, the Chancellor of the Exchequer recognised this expressly in his early justification for his golden rule that over the economic cycle the government will borrow only to invest and not to fund current spending, when he stated that the government does not pass on the costs of services consumed today to the taxpayers of the future. Each generation is expected to meet the current cost of the public services from which they benefit. I've spoken in this House before in relation to the principle of generational conflict, and nowhere in my view is it more pronounced than in the area of pensions reform. Unfunded public pension liabilities mean that tomorrow's taxpayers will be obliged to fund today's ever larger deficits. Alternatively, those who've made their pension contributions in good faith will see that their entitlement collapse. Pensions payments are another example of deferred expenditure, or put another way, of government borrowing. Now, another element of the unsung extent of government borrowing is in the field of public pensions. The government has claimed that its unfunded public pensions liability amounted to some £460 billion as of 31st March 2004. However, this figure was calculated on the basis of a discount rate of 3.5%, which the government's Actuary Department have now revised downwards to 2.8%. In answer to parliamentary questions on this matter, the Treasury accept that the total liability of unfunded public pensions amounts to some £650 billion, and the unfunded element of local government pension schemes to an additional £70 billion. Once more, there is no easy way out. In essence, today's pensioners, and those retiring in the near future, will be able to rely upon considerably more generous benefits than those just entering the workplace who will be paying for those liabilities. Given the fact that there are twice as many voters over the age of 55 as under the age of 35, and that they are twice as likely to vote itself, it is unrealistic, to put it mildly, to expect anyone in the political arena, across the political divide, to stand up and state some fairly bald facts on this matter. Nevertheless, in spite of the orchestrated campaigns from today's pensioners' groups, the fact really is that today's pensioners have never had it so good. The reason why many pensioners in their 70s and 80s believe they have so little is because they've failed to pay anything like enough into the system to warrant what they now expect to receive. And I'm very sad to say that these unrealistic expectations have been created and are periodically raised by politicians across the political spectrum. This somewhat unpalatable message is one that does not play any part in the policy prospectus of any major political party, perhaps for rather obvious reasons. However, it is clear that this state of affairs cannot continue indefinitely. The unspoken message of the political class to anybody under the age of 30 is that your generation will not only have to foot the bill for the unfunded cost of pensioners for those who are older, but you'll also need to significantly lower your own financial expectations when the time comes for you to retire and benefit in some way from public pensions. I believe that we do run the risk of quite serious social unrest in the decades ahead as the evidence of this appalling generational pyramid sales scam becomes evident. For there's no doubt that future government spending will have to be much higher, not least because there will be ever fewer people in the workforce having to subsidise an ever larger number of dependents, whilst the costs of the National Health Service, for example, continue to rise exponentially as the population ages. Mr. Pope, I fear that this off-sheet balance sheet financing is delaying some very tough decisions that need to be made about the future of public spending. It also delays our debate on the way we need to manage public services in future to deliver equity and social cohesion, as well as providing for the vulnerable and the voiceless in our society. One of the more depressing aspects of the years ahead is that my generation will have been seen as having had it easy. This era, I fear, may be seen as being the best of times. We are consuming what we believe we are entitled to without regard to the costs. And I think that the liabilities for this short-sighted and selfish approach will now have to be met by future generations.
Balls.
Thank you, Mr. Pope. And it's a pleasure once again to serve under your chairmanship, I think for the first time in Westminster Hall. And can I congratulate the Honourable Member opposite, the Member for the Cities of London, for securing this adjournment debate today. I know that he does a great deal of work in the City of London to pursue the interests of the companies working and operating there. And I've had the opportunity to discuss those issues with him many times. And I also appreciate that the comments he's made in this debate today are sincerely made, and I would like to respond to them. I thought it was rather brave, his rather Macmillan-esque reference to pensioners today never having it so good. And I agree with him that no one wants to be in a position where we are mortgaging the future or stacking up liabilities which future generations won't be able to afford. But I hope that I will be able to reassure him that we aren't being cavalier in our outlook, we are not being short-termist, we aren't being selfish, that the fiscal framework which we are operating and the decisions we've made within that, alongside our commitment to best international practice in accounting standards, actually mean that we have been keeping a firm grip on the national debt and at the same time putting in place the resources for investment which will deliver returns for the current but also future generations. He talked about the inheritance, Mr. Pope, and it is true that in 1997 we inherited a PFI programme. A PFI programme which was rather blanket in its operation at the time and which required some refocusing by the incoming government. We also inherited a commitment from the previous government to adopting international practice in the scoring of liabilities and assets on the public balance sheet, a commitment which we've continued and developed as international best practice has changed. We also inherited a level of national debt which was high. It wasn't the highest of all countries, but it was higher than we felt was comfortable. And we also inherited a position in terms of public investment where there were, in our schools, in our hospitals, in our transport infrastructure, very substantial backlogs in terms of investment. And the fiscal regime which we put in place, the golden rule which the Honourable Member referred to, and our commitment to borrowing on the balance sheet within a ceiling for overall net debt, have actually allowed a very substantial increase in public spending on public investment. And the majority of the advances we've seen in terms of investment in health and education, in transport, have actually occurred on the balance sheet, on the public balance sheet. That is where the majority of our public investment or of our investment in public services has gone. But at the same time, the Honourable Gentleman is right that we have reformed but also expanded our approach to using the private finance initiative. We've had over 185 health facilities built or refurbished under PFI, 230 new or refurbished schools, 43 new transport projects, 9 waste and water projects, 180 other projects in sectors including defence, prisons, housing and leisure. We've used the private finance initiative where we judge that we can achieve a better contractual relationship between public and private sectors, a better partnership, if you like, to use the best skills and techniques of the private sector in management and cost control in order to deliver better public services. And just to give one fact, which I think explains why, for myself and for the Treasury, the experience with PFI has been very positive, is that of major PFI investment projects which have been completed, which have been enacted and completed, they've been completed on time in almost 90% of cases. And in every case, since 1997, the public sector has paid what it set out to pay. Whereas in traditional procurement, historically, the public sector has tended to see 3/4 of projects provided by the private sector to the public sector through traditional means. And 3/4 of them were late, and 3/4 of them traditionally were over budget. What we've actually managed to do through PFI is to bind the private sector into a better contractual relationship with the public sector while harnessing its innovation and discipline to modernise public services. Now, for me, those have been the benefits of PFI. And I say to the Honourable Gentleman, it has never been the government's intention or motivation with PFI to set out to move public spending off balance sheet. As I said, the large majority of the expansion in public investment or investment in public services has been on balance sheet. But where we judged for particularly long-term and large projects, there were risks in the traditional procurement mechanisms of being late or over budget. PFI has actually provided a much better way of providing value for money for the public sector than traditional procurement. And in those areas, such as small projects, or particularly IT projects, where it's very hard to specify in advance, in contract, the nature of the procurement. In those areas, we've actually have withdrawn from using PFI and announced that in a document a couple of years ago. Because in those areas, PFI was very hard to specify. In those areas where projects are large, can be specified, and where traditionally procurement has been expensive and late, in my experience, PFI has delivered much better value for money for the public sector. But at all times, the decision as to whether a PFI project is on or off balance sheet has not been made by the government. It's been made independently of government. The accounting judgment is taken by the relevant independent audit body, the National Audit Office, the Audit Commission, or the audit bodies for the devolved administrations. These auditors use the same independent accounting standards that the private sector uses, which are consistent with UK GAAP accounting standards. Where the accountants judge the deal to be off the public sector balance sheet because the risk is genuinely being transferred, it seems to me that it would be wrong to second-guess the view of independent accountants and score it on budget anyway, in exactly the same way as it would be wrong for us to override the judgment of independent auditors and accountants, where they judge that the PFI project should become on balance sheet. And as the Honourable Member will know, around half of all PFI projects have been scored onto the public balance sheet, including the Tube, and most of the, I think probably all of the prison building programme, because the risk, as he says, is with the public sector. In other areas, the risk has been transferred. But even where the risk is still with the government, and therefore the project score on balance sheet, it's still, in our judgment, value for money for the public sector because of those improvements in quality and timeliness and affordability, plus the innovation which you can get from a proper partnership between public and private sector to continue with PFI. We are advised by an independent advisory body who looks at these issues all the time. We try to make sure that we keep in touch with best international practice. In terms of the PFI rules we use, and he talked about the unitary payment, we correctly classify those payments onto the balance sheet depending upon the advice of accountants, and indeed do so exactly in line with the practices used by private sector accountants. In the case of local authority deals, it's the Audit Commission who makes those judgments. In areas where there is not genuine risk transfer, or it turns out that we aren't delivering value for money, the government has in fact been willing to act. And I would just quote one contract, Teddington Science Lab, where the contractor failed to deliver through the PFI project, and the government terminated the deal. So it's not true that we haven't been willing to act where the private sector didn't deliver, but in the main, the large majority of cases, the PFI process has been delivering value for money, even when it's been scored onto the public balance sheet. The Honourable Member quoted two cases. One, the case of London and Continental Railways, where at every stage full information was provided by the government to the ONS and to the National Audit Office. We acted in good faith. We told the ONS in 1998 about all the facts which were relevant. The Department of Transport have always accounted for their relationship in a correct and transparent manner. And the Honourable Gentleman is right that the ONS re-examined the case in the light of evolving international accounting practice and decided to change their view on the scoring. That is perfectly appropriate. It was for them to make that decision, not for government. We have never sought to second-guess those judgments. I'm very happy to give way to the gentleman.
Field. I would secretary at the Economic Secretary for giving way. Perhaps you could give me some indication as to how the Office of National Statistics become involved in this sort of process. Is it through their own work in this matter? Again, is it central government to put forward various PFI projects to ask whether they should or should not appear on balance sheet? I think it just goes to this transparency, and I accept none of these things are entirely straightforward, because we live in a very, very complicated financial world where there are ever more complicated financial instruments being created. And obviously it is with this in mind that we need to know how independent the ONS's judgment is in this regard, but also for many other projects which people on this side of the political divide think should be going on balance sheet.
I challenge the Honourable Member to produce evidence to suggest that the Office of National Statistics has not been allowed to act in a free and independent way in these matters. He also raised the issue of Network Rail, which was a body set up at arm's length from government in the aftermath of the rail track difficulties. The judgment as to where Network Rail should score was a matter for the ONS in their capacity as an operationally independent agency. They judged it was a private sector company. In reaching that decision, they used internationally agreed standards, ESA, for producing national accounts. They sought and received advice from the EU statistical agency Eurostat. That was a matter for them, not a matter for government. The same was true in the case of, as he said, LCR, where they took a different view. And in each year, in the national accounts, the decisions as to the scoring of PFI are being made not by the Treasury, but by the ONS, because it's their responsibility to produce these accounts. And if they, or international practice, changes, then the government would then need to respond to that. But we use the best practice as it is at the time. The same thing is true. He also mentioned the issue of public sector pensions, where again, the matter for the scoring of those liabilities has been a long-established one based upon international best practice. Where the government's position hasn't changed now compared to the position pre-1997. I would urge him, don't be fooled for the idea this is an off-balance sheet ruse. As I said, the majority are coming onto the balance sheet of the government. This is actually about an effective partnership between public and private sector to make sure we get the best value for money in the procurement process. And where we can demonstrate that that can be delivered, PFI is the right answer. where it doesn't deliver value for money, we shouldn't go down the PFI route. In my judgment, that is independent of the scoring or balance sheet decision, which is a matter for international advice and international best practice.
Order. This sitting stands adjourned. Thank you.